Hello, and thank you for attending the second of our webinar series for 2017. I'm Anthony Radich, the Executive Director of WESTAF, the Western States Arts Federation. Today's webinar is titled Principles of Persuasive Argumentation, How to Effectively Communicate Your Case for the Arts. We at WESTAF do a lot in the area of data and data that can support arguments. The Creative Vitality Suite is our data tool here at WESTAF that is both interactive and able to be accessed by zip code, county, city, state, national comparisons, whatever. It's a pretty robust tool. Today with us is Professor Damien Pfister. He's Associate Professor of Communication at the University of Maryland, and his work examines the confluence of digitally networked media, rhetorical practice, public deliberation, and visual culture. That sounds like a lot. Basically, he's a very talented guy with a lot of publications, and I want to talk to him a little bit about that in a few minutes. But before I do, I just want to talk about something that's on probably everyone's mind. We know the National Endowment for the Arts is under threat again. The purpose of these webinars is to really talk about data and use of data, but we really thought for this series we should talk a bit about the argumentation that could be made around some of the data available. But so that's the conversation today. The next webinar that's coming up will be called Navigating the Political Landscape, and that will actually have elected officials on the line talking about how they respond to arguments based on data and what they expect from data, et cetera, et cetera. So that should be fun, so dial in next time. Again, before we start with Damon, I want to talk about something that is really prevalent in our work here, and that is confusion over data streams. There are a lot of data streams that in the arts, and there is a lot more confusion than there are data streams, frankly. So let me just quickly go over the three core data streams that are frequently confused. One is the Creative Vitality Suite, which is WESTAF's data stream related to creative economy. It's produced in collaboration with Economic Modeling Specialists International. We have data in the areas of industry earnings, occupations, and you can divide this up, as I said earlier, by zip code, MSA, whatever. So it's an interactive tool, actually, through which you can access up-to-date, annually revised, updated data. Another tool that's out there, a data stream out there, is Arts and Economic Prosperity, which is the data stream presented by Americans for the Arts. This is something that's done every 5 years. There's a new one coming out in June. I think they're going to present it at their annual conference in San Francisco. And this is a set of data that is developed from survey sampling that is then manufactured, run through a model to get some national data. So that's Americans for the Arts tool. Then one more that's fairly recent, in the last few years, is a National Endowment for the Arts and Bureau of Economic Analysis data stream, really looking at the role, the size of the creative economy in the U.S. The data in this tool is very similar to what we have in Creative Vitality Suite. A huge difference is that it's available on a national and state level only, so somewhat limited. So that's please stop being confused about data streams. There are ways to access them differently. They do different things. And let's go on to Damon, our guest today. Damien Pfister, could you tell us something about yourself and your work before we start this webinar?
Certainly. Thanks, Anthony, and thank you for having me here today. So I'm an Associate Professor of Communication at the University of Maryland in College Park in the greater DC metro area. And my work really focuses on the impact that digital media technologies have on communication and culture. And I paid special attention in the last decade or so to how new genres of digital communication like blogs, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and so on shape public arguments, often about civic controversies. I'm really interested in how these new emerging genres of communication provide opportunities for citizens to affect public deliberation and how citizens use the affordances of these technologies in order to have an impact in their communities. This is obviously a timely and consequential area of research, and it is both challenging and fun to try to make sense of the dramatic changes that we are witnessing in a moment of pretty radical media change. So I've written on this topic in a variety of publications. I'll highlight just a couple of book projects here. So in 2014, the Penn State University Press published my first book, Networked Media, Networked Rhetoric, Attention and Deliberation in the Early Blogosphere. So this book focuses on what seems like distant history now, the growth of the blogosphere. The blogs are often lambasted for being erroneous, hateful, or just bloviation. But there is a counter narrative here that could be told about how blogs really vivify citizen argumentation. One of the key sort of theoretical points that I make in the book is that bloggers were sort of at the avant-garde of managing information abundance that has been produced by digital media technologies. So bloggers have unique capacities in sort of sifting through all of the information that we have and leveraging their own expertise in order to make sense of very arcane scientific topics and very general public topics. One of the things that this really brought to the fore for me was the value of attention in this process. So getting, sustaining, and transforming attention has always been a crucial dimension of persuasion, but I think that it is sort of on the ascent. It is increasingly important in times of information abundance to have these skills of getting, sustaining, and transforming attention. And this is the art of rhetoric. This is what Aristotle was talking about 2,500 years ago, though maybe some different terms. And my work is really working to extend this rhetorical tradition into the 21st century. And I've been turning back to the ancient world for some inspiration there. So I'm very excited about a forthcoming volume edited with my colleague Michelle Kennerly of Penn State titled Ancient Rhetorics and Digital Networks. That's coming out in February 2018 with the University of Alabama Press. And in that book, we're making the case that ancient rhetorics have a renewed salience for those of us navigating digital media environments. It turns out, as we argue, that morality, digitality have more in common with each other than not in common.
Well, David, we're really glad you can join us. You have a lot of expertise, and actually I would have to say it sounds like you invented your career 20 years in the future and look back and crafted it. This is exactly the middle of where a lot of conversation is today. So you are very fortunate to have the qualifications and already a number of major accomplishments in the academic field to address some of the current issues we're facing. Before we go into your commentary, I just want to note to the participants that this will be a 35-minute approximate webinar, and following the presentation, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. I also want to note that listeners who joined us in the past, we covered a number of items in the last webinar. Damien will cover most of those and relate them to his argumentation topic today, but I want to cover one in particular. Last time we talked about using data and different aspects of use of data, but I want to emphasize using the correct data. I'm going to emphasize this because I've seen this done really inappropriately in recent advocacy meetings. People select the incorrect data to prove something that frankly can't be proved with the data. So please take the time when you're, as an advocate, working with data to select the correct data that actually is a reflection of the point you're trying to make. And people are here at WESTAF and elsewhere, NASA, AFTA, available to help you make sure that there is a nexus between the data you are presenting as in your argument and the successful outcome of the argument. Before, again, we go to Damon, I just want to flash on the screen quickly an overview of what he's going to talk about. Now, I know you can't absorb that in the 2 minutes that's up on the screen, but I want to let you know this webinar will be available after the fact, so you can pick this up and see, look at the structure of this webinar. All right, so let's turn to Damon and talk a little bit about argument and how it differs from rhetoric. We hear those two words thrown around a lot, and it would be nice to know from an expert just what in heaven's name the difference is between the two.
Sure. Well, let me start with the term rhetoric. I mean, rhetoric is sort of the big umbrella term, and synonyms often include argument and persuasion, and there are some definitional differences that I can talk about. I think about the art of rhetoric as encompassing all of the manifold ways through which attention is shaped. Now, that could be a lot of things, right? Our attention is shaped through architecture. Our attention is shaped through nature. We look at pretty clouds in the sky, right? That gets our attention. So we could say, well, the clouds are rhetorical, but we probably wouldn't say that the clouds are argumentative. So the definition of argument that I use is the practice of justifying claims for an audience's assent, where assent means the audience's adherence. I really like this definition for a number of reasons. First, it's audience-centered, right? You're trying to move another. Argument is not about self-persuasion. I mean, presumably, you're already persuaded on the point. Secondly, it really emphasizes seeking assent being voluntary adherence to the claim, right? So you're not trying to force an opinion on someone else. You are trying to get them to see the wisdom of your argument and, internalize that to some degree. And finally, argument focuses on justification or evidence. So evidence, there's a range of different kinds of evidence, as I'll talk about shortly. But argumentation is very focused on that kind of data and using that kind of data to guide judgment. So argumentation in general is a kind of rhetoric that's more formal, propositional, and focused on evidence or data. But it's still intimately connected to the formation and transformation of attention processes. So if you think about, for example, the big takeaway points from the prior webinar, personalizing the data was one of the tips. Well, of course, personalizing the data is going to arrest someone's attention more than just generic data. Different audiences require different messaging. That, too, makes sense to this kind of lens of attention. Right? You're not going to talk to a group of experts like you would talk to a group of kindergartners, and you want to talk to kindergartners like you would talk to a group of experts. You'll lose the kindergartners pretty quickly if you talk to them like experts. Trust me, I know. I have a 4-year-old. And then you don't want to overwhelm with data. That was another big takeaway point. If you overwhelm people with one kind of evidence, you're going to tax their attentional resources. They're going to be looking for something different. And that's one of the things that I'll talk about shortly here.
Damien, a quick question for you. I know a few rhetoricians, and they go crazy when people say that's just rhetoric. And what do you say as a rhetorician when people say that's just rhetoric? Right.
Well, so that's often indicative of a kind of perception that there's a big difference between rhetoric and action. This is a very famous, political trope, is that they're all rhetoric. I'm a person of action. I would like us to think about how rhetoric is a kind of action. And in fact, rhetoric may be the most important kind of action, because if rhetoric is an art of attention, rhetoric shapes how we attend to things. The entailment there is that rhetoric shapes how we behave. It shapes our practices. It shapes our identity. And so, it makes a good line on a stump speech. But you'll notice that line is always delivered rhetorically. Right? I mean, it's always an effort to shape the attention of the crowd, to sort of orient the candidate as a person of action who's going to go and clean things up or do the right thing. But there's no escaping rhetoric. The question is always, what's the most productive kind of rhetoric? What are ethical kinds of rhetoric?
Well, thank you. That's really helpful. That moves beyond a rhetorician just being irritated, and it's a nice description of really what's going on there. Let's go on to your presentation around stasis.
Sure. So I sort of see there being four big parts of any kind of argument. And the first one is we refer to, as argumentation scholars, stasis. Right? You have to know what kind of argument you're having. And to do that, you must know your point of stasis. So stasis is an ancient Greek term that refers to the point at which an argument turns. It's important because different kinds of evidence are going to be needed and are going to be successful for different kinds of points of stasis. So the 4 points of stasis are definition, fact, value, and policy. And literally all arguments can be categorized in one of these 4 areas. This is a really all-encompassing kind of category. So arguments about definition. Well, in the field of arts and creativity, you may have arguments about what counts as a creative industry. Maybe that is straightforward to some people, but turns out it's actually trickier than you may think. In fact, I imagine there are probably arguments of definition about what the arts are. You know, what falls into the arts and what is, say, more the humanities or the sciences. I mean, some of these lines can be quite slippery. Arguments of fact. An example of that would be, does arts funding stimulate community employment and development? Right. This is a kind of argument where there's something sort of empirically verifiable should be able to decide that question. Arguments of value are a little trickier because the empirical world offers very little guidance about what we should value. So an example of the kinds of value propositions in arts education or in arts funding, should access to arts education be universal? That activates a number of different kinds of values that we might consider. Finally, there's policy. Should a new art center be funded by increasing property taxes? Now, policy arguments are the most complicated because they encompass all of the others. In order to have a successful policy argument, you will need to have good definition, strong facts, and values that orient you in a particular direction. Now, I suggested earlier that different kinds of evidence sort of will be successful for different kinds of arguments. So when you're having an argument about definition, you'll want to seek authoritative sources, like dictionaries or government agencies that operationalize a particular definition. In particular, you want to look for definitions that include and exclude, right? Definitions that clearly mark what is included in it and what is excluded in it is helpful because sometimes we have overly broad definitions, and those tend to be not very helpful at all. Facts, you need to have facts refer to empirically verifiable observations, and we tend to think about that in terms of numbers, but numbers are attractive because of their objectivity. But that, we all know that we can lie with numbers, right? There are whole college courses taught about how to lie with statistics. So when you're thinking about arguments over facts, don't get too invested in just thinking about statistical facts. There are different kinds of ways to prove things, which I'll talk about shortly. Values. When we're arguing about values, we often go to sources of moral inspiration, quotes from leaders or ancient texts. And those sources of moral inspiration kind of can guide our own moral orientation. Finally, policy. What kind of evidence do you need for policy? Well, you need evidence on the 3 prior points of stasis, plus some sort of evidence of advantage in changing from the status quo. So that's the tricky thing, is that when you're making arguments about policy, you're also making arguments about fact, about definition, about value. And you need to show what advantage will accrue to your position if you make some sort of policy change.
And if I could just take a minute here and note to our participants, this is a pretty simple and very straightforward model, but I think I recommend that when advocates as a groups perhaps are building arguments, maybe contact the local university and see if you can get a rhetorician to come over and help guide you through this. Again, it's not that complicated. However, people like Damon have had years and years of experience in doing this, and I think that we in the arts often take arguments that are sent out by national organizations, which are great, but we could be building these locally and regionally, and that may give us broader, stronger arguments. And Damon, Damon, how accessible are rhetoricians in any community these days?
Well, we're fairly accessible. I mean, a bunch of us are on Twitter, and we all have email addresses. And I would endorse that recommendation, because I think that a lot of scholars across the academy are looking for ways to get involved and looking for ways to harness their own expertise in civically responsible ways. Now, rhetoricians, we're also sort of under threat as humanists, and so I think some strategic alliances between the humanities and the arts could be very fruitful for both.
Great, excellent advice. Let's move on to your next area.
So this one's a little brief, but potent. So the second big sort of tip that I have is that you want to balance types of data that you are marshaling to prove your case. So in argumentation studies, we tend to talk about three kinds of data: statistics, testimony, and example. So statistics, I won't belabor too much. They're obviously important, especially in thinking about sort of aggregate behavior, averages and medians and means and GDPs and so on and so forth. They can be very important ways to appeal to numbers-oriented people. But I would caution you against too many statistics. We tend to kind of zone out if a speech or a report is just sort of statistic piled on after statistics. So think about balancing the kinds of evidence that you are marshaling by including testimony and example. In terms of testimony, we think about both expert testimony and layperson testimony. So different kinds of testimony will be appropriate for different kinds of arguments. Expert testimony may be more appropriate if there are technical details about a program, say a program budgetary impact. It might be appropriate to have the budget director from the local mayor's office weigh in here. But in terms of other kinds of testimony, other kinds of arguments, you might have more layperson testimony about the impact of the arts or arts education on their own lives would be more effective. In terms of example, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say this is great because I think, again, some falsehood that sometimes pervades our world in arts advocacy is that there is a silver bullet. There would be a single statistic. There would be one expert. But I think this is a great overview of how really it's a blend of things that will make success in advocacy.
Yeah, it's a common belief, that persuasion and argumentation would be easier if there was just, if people just accepted this one piece of evidence, right? Or if they just, but the truth is that argumentation is a human endeavor. And as a human endeavor, it's complicated. And the more you do it, the more complicated it gets. And the answer to everything is always, it depends. It's frustrating for my students to hear that, and I know why, but argumentation is a situated art. And so you can't just say, well, just introduce statistical evidence and then you'll be okay, because it is more complicated than
Well, let's go on to the Toolman model that you're going to talk about. It's a very powerful model, and I'd like to hear you explain it to the group.
Great. So yeah, that's my third tip, is know the Toolman model, named after the famous 20th century philosopher Stephen Toolman. It's widely seen as the most foundational model of argument. And it's useful because it shows you how to develop a strong argument that goes below surface level claims. So the four main features of the Toolman model are data, claim, warrant, and backing. So it all starts with data. It all starts with the available evidence that you have. What sort of argument can your data support? Some people try to torture their data, but in today's world where people are kind of savvy at research aided by the internet, you can't torture it too much. Data is somewhat recalcitrant, and it, while it's always interpretable, it can only support certain kinds of claims. The claim is the overarching point. It's the statement being argued. And it should be a non-intuitive argument, or a non-intuitive claim. That's what makes an argument and not a fact. And I think most of us can sort of recognize, okay, yes, an argument is a combination of data and a claim. That's kind of the common sense way of thinking about arguments. The two other dimensions of the Toolman model is what really sort of makes this a useful model. The first other dimension then is the warrant, or inference. Right? The warrant is the inference required to connect the data to the claim. Why is that data that actually supports the claim? What do you need to believe in order to believe that that data supports the claim? And the way in which we support warrants is through backing. So backing is support for the inference made by the warrant. It's why the inference is a good or a valid inference. Let me work through an argument for arts funding using the Toolman model here. And I think you can sort of see how this creates a more kind of developed argumentative structure. So let's say you want to make an argument about the arts as a way to better the community, and specifically at-risk youth's role in the community. So you have some data that after-school arts programs improve student performance in school. Okay? Now that could, I think, support a claim that arts programs, especially those maybe targeted at at-risk youth, could improve learning outcomes in school. Maybe you've got some statistical evidence about grades. Maybe you've also got some testimony by teachers who are experts, in learning. And by extension, you want to argue that improving learning outcomes will improve the overall health of the community. Now, why does improving students' grades better the community? We may intuit there's a connection there, but we need a warrant. We need to develop a connection there. Right? So what connects the data about your arts program to better grades, to better community? Well, how would you develop this warrant? I think it's, there's a couple of different ways you could go. You could say improving grades means more and better post-secondary educational opportunities. It means less people dropping out of high school and loitering around the gas station looking for trouble, so on and so forth. We need some backing for that warrant, right? Because surely we know people with good grades who have fallen into lives of petty crime. But I think in general, there's pretty good evidence that after-school programs improves grades. So maybe you could look for analogies, right? So sports teams and debate teams, there's a lot of evidence that both of those kinds of programs keep students out of trouble and allow them to focus their energies in productive ways. So that could be good backing, sort of evidence by analogy for how your arts program could do something similar in terms of community betterment. There's two other dimensions of the Toolman model that I'll talk about just briefly. The first is qualifier, which is basically a way to calibrate your argument and say, look, in certain circumstances, this is true, right? So in these instances, sometimes when these conditions are present, whenever you use those kinds of arguments, or those kinds of phrases, you're using qualifiers. And those can be useful simply to sort of express your how reasonable a person you are, how reasonable your argument is, right? You're not a kind of ideologue who believes that arts education is the single thing that will improve the world. Now, I happen to maybe sort of believe that, but I think not many people are super receptive to that argument. The world's a complicated place. But you say, in these instances, right, in these circumstances, arts education can make a huge impact in the lives of students and our community. Now, the rebuttal is the other part of the Toulmin model that I think is interesting. And this is an answer, sometimes preemptive, to common counter-arguments. Okay, so I wish that we saw this more in our public discourse, where we sort of said, look, I know the argument against, right? So I know the argument against arts education funding. It costs taxpayer dollars, right? But every dollar of taxpayer money that goes towards arts education now saves $10 in taxpayer money that funds prisons later. Right? That's an example of a rebuttal, right? Where you say, yes, arts education is not free, but it is cost effective. Okay? And if you can have some powerful support for that rebuttal, then you preempt the common counter argument before it's even occurred.
Just thinking again, Damon, how this is another opportunity for arts organizations to have workshops for board members and advocates and designed arguments. You've got the Toulmin model and you have the stasis framework. So that would be something I would certainly encourage people on this webinar to think about doing.
Absolutely. Let me just briefly mention the sort of fourth pillar for a strong argument that I think, and that is evidence and the quality of evidence that you're working with. We think usually in terms of 8 criteria: recency, sufficiency, relevancy, and clarity. I think that those criteria are pretty straightforward, but they're certainly worth thinking about when you are developing an argument. 4 other criteria: consistency, qualification, bias, and representativeness are also important to think about. Right? So when we think about consistency, we think about if the support, if the evidence is resonant with other evidence, or if there are strong counterexamples that opponent might draw upon in rebutting your claim. Qualification is incredibly important. That's a way that many people use to manage information abundance, is to say, well, where is this source coming from? There's a big difference between an expert who has spent their lives thinking and studying about a certain issue and someone who just started a blog or a Twitter account and is sort of spouting off about things they may not know that much about. Bias is certainly an important issue. We all have biases, and all evidence is biased in some ways, but there certainly are degrees of bias. And representativeness is another important criteria. Think about representativeness in terms of cherry picking. We see a lot of examples of cherry picking evidence where there's just selective pieces of evidence that are picked out of a pile of perhaps counter evidence, right, that actually argues for the exact opposite point. That's a really big problem in our public discourse writ large. But I think, just as an advocate yourself, you want to be responsible in making sure that the evidence that you are highlighting is representative of the evidence in toto. So not picking just that little, bright little cherry that, you think is kind of calling out to you, but doing kind of more due diligence and making sure that it is indeed representative of the broader evidence that you have.
Well, that's a great list of criteria, and I would recommend, again, that our participants think about different data streams that are out there and use some of these criteria to evaluate how strong they would play as evidence in argumentation. And this is a great list to kind of review those with. But let's go on here. Damon, before we let you go, let me ask you about data and the difference, if any, in terms of a data-driven argument and arguments that don't use data. What do you see as the difference there?
Well, I think that yeah, an argument that doesn't use data is maybe not even an argument. You know, it's just sort of a claim. If you follow the Toolman model, having data is fundamental to an argument. I always tell my students that an argument is like a house. You know, you need a strong foundation for that house. And the foundation of that house, of argument, is data. And, you know, I think it really is, it is important. It's a fundamental part of any kind of argument. But I also think that it just participates in the larger kind of data-driven discourses that we see in our society. And that can be quite useful. You know, we're living in the world of big data. We've got all kinds of new analytical tools that are opening up realms of human experience and human practices that have been pretty opaque before now. And so it's kind of an exciting time to be making arguments and to be making data-driven arguments because we've got so much of it and people are really sort of thinking about this in interesting and complicated ways now.
And how do you recommend using or not using visuals in argumentation?
I think visual representations can be very powerful evidence. I would say, you know, think about this in terms of trying to appeal to wider audiences and different learning styles. You know, some people are very text-driven, or very numbers-driven. Some people are very visual-driven. One question that I think advocates might ask themselves as they're creating visuals and creating infographics, are your graphics retweetable? You know, we're living in the golden age of the infographic. The infographics today are just amazing. I was really excited by a couple of years ago, the Pew Center for Research started to make their infographics individually retweetable. So like anyone could find an infographic in a larger report and tweet that. And that really started to, those particular infographics started to circulate and draw more attention, suck people into the larger research report, the larger story that the Pew folks were trying to tell. I think that's a kind of clever way to think about the role of visual images. I mean, they're visually arresting in their own ways at sometimes, but they also can draw people in to learn more and to see different kinds of evidence, not just visual evidence, but testimony and statistics and so on. So absolutely, I think, we're a very visual culture, and if you're not using visuals in some way, you're not going to appeal to a very wide audience.
Damon, you have a background in classical rhetoric. You also follow contemporary rhetoricians and theorists. What do you see for the future? What's coming up that we should be paying attention to in the field of rhetoric as it relates to argumentation?
It's hard to say. I think in some ways it's old wine in new bottles. We're just the fundamentals of argumentation and the fundamentals of rhetoric, I don't think have changed too much because I don't think people have changed too much. So in rhetoric, we often begin our students' education in the rhetorical process by referring them to Aristotle's famous rhetorical triangle: logos, pathos, and ethos. And that's a bit antiquated, but it gets you going in the right direction. We are motivated by argument. We're motivated by emotion. We're motivated by the character of others. What's interesting to me is just how that is changing. So if you think about character, for example, we used to establish our own moral character by living in a physical, geographical community with others, right? You could say, look, I know the person down the street, they're a good egg, right? and I've got 20 years of history with this person. They mow their grass every Sunday. Garbage is out. It's always in the can, and the can disappears by Monday morning, right? And presumably there are other conversations and so on that kind of fill in the moral character of your neighbor. Well, we're now living in a global society where we don't have that kind of physical or geographical proximity to others. So how do we learn about each other's character? How are reputations established? How are they degraded over time? And that's kind of a thorny puzzle that we're sort of working out in rhetorical studies. So one thing that I would say is that reputation, for example, right, if we think about reputation as part of one's moral character, part of one's ethos, reputation is in part determined by performance at various argumentative skills. And so when we're arguing on Facebook over the latest Trump scandal, or if we're arguing on Twitter about the broader stakes of climate change, part of how we develop our reputation is our skill in argument. And that's why I kind of think that the ancients are kind of coming back. These folks who are really focused on the art of rhetoric, the art of attention, more and more people are kind of turning back to them. And you could do worse than to turn back to Aristotle or Isocrates or Protagoras and the various commentators on those authors in order to get a firmer foothold on our contemporary digital media environment.
Well, thank you, Damon. Obviously, there's a lot more to talk about, and especially the current world of politics and its relationship to argumentation and rhetorical principles, et cetera. So that would be fun sometime, and maybe we'll get a few questions in that area. But I really want to thank you for being with us and taking time to prepare this really helpful webinar for advocates. It's a very important time for us, as I said earlier. I want to put on the screen Damon's website and Twitter handle. And again, you can retrieve this from us later on if you don't catch it here. And I know Damon doesn't want to be a matchmaker for every rhetorician in every part of the country, but I think if you need to locate someone and you can't do it through WESTAF, contact him. And I'm sure Damon would like to hear from you if you have some interesting dimensions of work you'd like to put before him. So, Damon, again, thank you so much. And we now are going to go forward with questions. And I see we have a few up on the screen already, so let's begin. So the first question we see here is, where does emotion fit into your model, Damon? And how does it relate to the principles of persuasive argument? So emotion and argumentation question.
That's a great question, and it's, in fact, one of the common critiques of the Toulmin model is that the Toulmin model kind of is too data-driven, and people usually make decisions not just based on data, but also on emotion, on value. And that's kind of where I would orient the question asker. When you think about where emotions play in, very often, and not just in arguments about values, but also in arguments about policy where values are very much at play, the emotions are very much at play. And so thinking about choosing values to undergird your argument that will resonate with a wider public or with the decision makers that you are trying to appeal to can be very effective.
Great. Here's another question. I think this is maybe someone who's studied rhetoric before. In this model, are you saying that data is before claim? And the questioner says it seems it should be reversed. So is data before claim, or should those two be reversed? And what do you think?
Right. So when you are developing an argument, you want to start with the data, right? Because you want to make sure that your data can actually support the claim. When you're actually advancing the argument to a decision maker, you want to use the claim first. So you want to lead with the claim that building an arts center in this part of town will revivify this neighborhood center. Here's why. There's the data, for it. Now, that's not an ironclad rule. There are some circumstances in which actually leading with the data might be smarter, right? So you might, in that instance, underline how a particular neighborhood center has fallen on hard times, right? And sort of explain what exactly that entails, job loss, blighted buildings, unfilled storefronts, so on and so forth. And then, add some other evidence about the role of a vibrant arts community in a broader neighborhood development. Maybe you have a strong analogy, something in a neighboring city that they did. And then that might feed into your claim that we should build an arts center in this neighborhood. So, in general, yes, sometimes in general you want to kind of lead with the claim, but in developing an argument, you want to think data first and then think about what kinds of claims that supports. And you want to always be flexible enough to kind of adapt to the situation. And if the person that you are presenting this argument to is somewhat hostile to your argument, maybe you don't want to lead with the claim, right? Because that kind of, they'll figure out that you want something that you've already kind of figured it out yourself. Perhaps leading with different kinds of data would actually be more invitational in helping them kind of think through the problem with you, be a little less, create a little less of an oppositional approach there.
Great, thank you, Damon. Another question is, what is your suggestion to overcome generational beliefs that things won't change based on history, community, or religion? So, region, sorry.
Wow. Things won't change in terms of funding for the arts, is that, or just general beliefs and
generational beliefs that won't change? So I would assume strongly held long-term cultural beliefs that are held.
Well, those are certainly the hardest ones to tackle. On the one hand, I think one of the themes that I was trying to emphasize in the webinar was there's no simple solution. These long-standing generational beliefs, these long-standing cultural assumptions about the role that the arts and humanities play in our society, long-standing assumptions about who we are as a people, they're not going to change in one argumentative exchange. So one of the things that I think arts advocates and public advocates in general have to do a better job of is changing the culture itself, right? And the way that you do that is both having these arguments where they need to be had, but also creating an infrastructure and creating a community of engaged advocates and followers of your argument to work on those generational claims. Because while we may believe, hey, there really are some generational assumptions that are permanent and ever changing, I think that's not right. I think that actually culture changes quite quickly, and obviously advocates and arts advocates can have a big role in shaping that culture, but it's a process, and it is a process that requires more than one person and more than one argument.
I think we have time for just a couple more questions. One is I'll take on this one. Can you give us an example of how to use the CVI Creative Vitality Index information with the models you presented? And I'm not going to actually answer that question fully. That's something that Damon would collaborate with me on. But let me just illustrate something for you. I think it's important to know why you're using CVI data as data. What is the point you're trying to make? And I think people frequently get lost in this, and they think it's about only economic impact, when in fact you're talking frequently about like what is the overall creative activity in an area. And yes, there's an economic impact dimension to it. So again, I'm not going to go through a model. Unfortunately, don't have time for that. But I would say the clarity of what the purpose of the data is for is very important. Are you going to talk about, before City Council, talk about the overall creative economy, both for-profit and non-profit? Or are you talking about economic impact? That's a really different thing. And just to be really clear on that. Finally, question for Damon. What comments might you have about the presenter of arguments? I mean, this questioner says, you know, sometimes as an arts advocate, I approach an elected official feeling already compromised. I'm an arts advocate from the nonprofit sector, and I'm not saying I'm thought very little of, but I'm not maybe thought as much of as a giant oil company in my state. So the presenter, credibility, any comments on that, Damon?
Well, that is certainly an important part of argumentation. You know, I really focused on logos, but even as I mentioned, you know, the classical sort of principles of persuasion paired logos, you know, the argument one creates through speech with ethos, character, and pathos, emotion. So, you know, it's interesting that we've gotten two questions about emotion and about character, which I think is a recognition that when you're persuading someone, you've got to be kind of the total package. You know, you can't just have great evidence for something. You've also got to have outstanding character and play on folks' emotions in ethical ways, of course. Certainly, arts advocates don't have as easy a pathway to influence as big corporate lobbyists, but that is something that I think, you know, is not going to be solved particularly easily. I mean, I would think about perhaps, you know, I think this is what needs to happen in the larger context of just kind of assault against arts and humanities. I think that critics of the arts and humanities need to be invited to more arts and humanities activities. You know, I really think that the arts and humanities are what make life worth living, and that's a hard thing to sell. I mean, I understand that it kind of works at a certain level of abstraction, but I think that folks, even the most ardent critics of the arts and humanities, read novels, go to museums, watch movies. I mean, this is all part of, you know, the sort of cultural economy of expression that the arts and humanities facilitates. So I think that, you know, maybe inviting someone onto your home turf might be more effective and might kind of, you know, show a decision maker that this is a robust, exciting, dynamic part of the human condition, and maybe your own ethos and character will kind of be boosted by that. You know, maybe it'll never be as much of a boost as if you're donating $50,000 to their reelection fund, but if you can show, you know, that you're providing a valuable service to the community and encouraging human flourishing, I mean, even as abstract as that is, I mean, I think that maybe that's one way to persuade through not just argument, but through character as well.
Great. Well, listen, David, thank you for your help and advice throughout the preparation of this webinar. It's been really helpful. Thanks all to you who have joined us today. Hope you've learned something. And we have many, many more questions than we have time for answers. And those who identify themselves, we will get back to you with some concrete answers to the questions we weren't able to take through the webinar. So thank you very much. Look forward to our next webinar, and it will really deal more with data and interacting with elected officials. Interesting time to be talking about that. look for a notice on that coming your way pretty soon. That will be held in early June. Thank you very much.